Tanishi from Sports Wrap, and welcome to the BarnBurner TV Network on Zingo TV Channel 250. Please remember to download both the BarnBurner and Zingo TV apps in their respective app store on iOS and Android devices. While you download, make sure you rate and leave a comment. Both apps are free. Zingo TV is also available on Google Chromecast, Amazon Fire and Fire TV sticks, Roku and Roku sticks, and also on all smart TVs 2016 forward. I'm nervous about this episode because I'm trying to talk about gymnastics with someone who loves gymnastics, who was a big part of gymnastics. And there was a movie called I guess it was called The A Athlete.
Athlete A, yeah.
Yeah, and essentially, we live in a world today where predators do not, they don't tell people they're on their way, right? Predators work in the dark. Predators do terrible things when nobody's watching. So now what we've got is a case where gymnastics has been hit with various, I won't bore the people I'm not here to sensationalize anything. The conversation I want to have is with someone who's a former gymnast who loves gymnastics. And I would like to talk about the impact. We all know the wrongdoing has to be found and it has to be dealt with, correct? Number one.
Absolutely, yes.
The young men and women, boys and girls, need to be protected and to be safe when they're involved in gymnastics. Gymnastics Canada wants that. Gymnastics Ontario wants that. We all want that, right?
Yes, of course.
And the question is, how do we get there? And with what's going on, I'm not trying to minimize what's happening, but the truth is, when something happens, our minds go to the worst case scenario. Is that what happens, and what kind of effect does that have on gymnastics, and how can gymnastics overcome that, what happened, right?
Well, with the gymnastics, it's very different because, first of all, gymnastics is a young sport. Gymnasts start at a very young age and usually end their career at a very young age. So once they're already in the professional and elite level of gymnastics, they're still young kids. They're young girls, young boys. They're, 13 when they're in the national team, even younger sometimes. So they're really young. And for kids are very vulnerable. They don't know how the world works fully. They just kind of go with the flow, and it's really, it's easier for adult athletes to realize if something is wrong, and it's easier for adult athletes to speak out. So in gymnastics, because everyone is so young, kids are scared, and sometimes kids don't even know that something wrong happened. If the person is sweet with them, if they're nice, if they try to sugarcoat it but yet still doing something wrong, the athlete might think, there's nothing wrong. I mean, he's being so nice to me. He's talking nicely to me. That means there must be nothing wrong. So it's much, much easier to, do that kind of stuff, like the Larry Nassar case and the Athlete A movie, with young athletes, because if it was in another sport, if it was in another national team, anywhere where there are older athletes, I guarantee 100% it would have come out sooner. I'm not saying that every adult athlete would easily speak out about it as well, but I'm just saying I guarantee it would have came out sooner. So with gymnastics, the main thing is that the kids are young. They're more vulnerable. They don't have the experience. They're scared. So it's easier to, do those kind of things to kids. So that's the thing that is different about gymnastics, and that's something that, when implementing these rules and changes, people really have to think about.
I'm gonna take exception a little bit, or I'd like to sharpen what you said. No amount of time is too long. You know what I mean? Like, as soon as it happens, it's happening too long. You understand what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
I think, unfortunately, when it comes to things like this, how it affects an individual is not automatically understandable, not just by people, by you and I who hear about it, but by the person who's experiencing it. And you said it very eloquently and very correctly that these young children don't know what's happening is wrong. They know they don't, again, I don't want to put words in people's mouths. I'm sure they know there's something wrong. They just don't know what's wrong. They don't know. And from what I've heard and from what I've heard conversations about it, they start to think, well, I obviously gave him permission to do this, or one of the thoughts that comes into mind. So the point I'm trying to make is this: how do we, as a society, and as a fan of gymnastics, a lover of the sport of gymnastics, how do we put everything in context so that we ensure that the parents, the children, everybody's aware that we're aware and we're looking for this kind of stuff, and we're making sure it isn't going to happen, and it's not going to happen without us finding out? That's the A part. The B part is, how do we hire people, bring people in? Every year, we have provinces, and we have 700 clubs in those provinces, separate clubs. How do you watch all those clubs? How do you look over those clubs? All those clubs are looking for coaches every year, Elizabeth. There's a lot of people that move in and you really don't know anything about.
Well, you're absolutely right. The thing is, you don't know, and there is no way to know who will do that kind of stuff, or who won't. There is no, you can have, take the Larry Nassar case as an example. He had the best qualifications, amazing doctor, nicest person. No one could have ever suspected him. Nicest guy, nicest person, friends with everyone in the community, had multiple degrees, amazing doctor, years of experience. Yet this happens. And it doesn't happen once, it was happening for 26 years or so. So there is no way to know. But the thing is, how this can be prevented is people around, everyone around, because it can't be that all people like that in one club are bad and will do that kind of stuff. No, there will be people who won't. And those people, if they see a slight thing that's wrong, if they see an athlete uncomfortable, if they see that an athlete is behaving differently, they need to be alert. They need to talk to the athlete and they need to understand, because it starts with one person, but then, if no one prevents that one person from doing something like that, then it will keep happening. People around that one bad person have to take action, or else it won't be stopped. As in the film, since we started talking about it, in the film Athlete A, even though it started with Larry Nassar, USA Gymnastics was at fault as well, and they were in a very big fault, because so many people around knew what was going on. Adults, directors of the organization, heads of the women's program knew what was going on. Yet they didn't report it to the police. Yet they didn't do anything about it. So if they would have done something about it, years and years of this torturous behavior could have been prevented. So that's how people can stop such things from happening in the future.
They're complicit with what he's doing. So what I'm learning from what you're saying, and what I'll offer is this: we have to figure out how to disable that kind of behavior, disable it immediately, where every athlete is aware of what they can or cannot do, and let's bear in mind as well, this can't turn into witch hunts, right? Because there has to be at least a disabling of this kind of behavior, and to ensure that the kind of behavior that's being disabled is actually happening. That is the opposite end of the pendulum. What happens with society is, when we finally realize something wrong is happening, there's another side that comes up, and then there's the side that comes up that uses that to punish people who maybe didn't even do that. We've seen that as well. So it's a major challenge to ensure that the people who are identified as being red flags, or we have red flags about people, that we learn about them as quickly as possible, and ensure that when we accuse somebody of something like that, we ensure that that person is also guilty of that, at first removed, and then work on whether the person's guilty or whether they're innocent, and then they can come back. But what I can tell you, in society, unfortunately, once there's an accusation of something like that, Elizabeth, that person's life is over. You know, even if they're found innocent. That's what I've learned and what I've seen. And maybe that's the reason why some people enable that kind of behavior. We have to figure out how to protect the young athlete, but not by destroying someone who may or may not have done something. That's the challenge, right? I know the world wants to say, let's side completely with the child. Of course we should side with the child. But we should also make sure that the accusations are true, you know, and there should be a way to do it that doesn't create a firestorm. And that's the part, my point with you, what would help with gymnastics is if this is handled not with no one knowing, but the right people knowing, and it's dealt with in a way that's respectful for what the accusation is. Because what that guy did and what he got away with, that athlete A refers to, is unacceptable. It's unconscionable. And he was enabled, he was allowed to do it because people did not stop him, you know, and they didn't believe, you know, I don't know. I guess in the movie, I saw the movie when it first came out, so I'm sorry if the memory of the movie doesn't, because it interests me a lot, because I did a lot with gymnastics. You wonder how you can avoid that kind of stuff. It seems we're so ill-equipped, Elizabeth. As an athlete, what would you want to hear from somebody who runs the organization? What do you want to hear from them that they should do, how they can hear you and other athletes?
You know, Frank, you said a few very good points. You know, the first thing is, yes, sometimes someone can accuse another person of doing something wrong, and that person might not even be guilty. And it's really important to identify that the person is actually guilty, because there have been incidents like that before, when the person actually didn't do anything and then he's sentenced for life in prison, and then his life is basically over, and years later it comes out that he's actually innocent, or she. So it's really important to identify that kind of aspect, that they are actually guilty. But you know, in the case of Larry Nassar, and in the case of a lot of things in gymnastics, because this, not just, you know, sexual abuse, but abuse in general in gymnastics is pretty common, which is pretty sad. Because, you know, again, they're kids, and, you know, when you're a kid, it's really hard to identify that something wrong, as I said, and they're also scared. They're scared because look what happened to athlete A, who's now, you know, obviously everyone knows it's Maggie Nichols. She came out and she said that this was wrong, and she got thrown off of the Olympic team. So they're afraid of the consequences. So to answer your question, Frank, the number one thing that should be done is we have to make sure that the gymnasts, if we're talking specifically about gymnastics, shouldn't be afraid to speak up, and shouldn't be afraid that if they do speak up, that there will be consequences for them, you know, because a lot of the times athletes are afraid to say something because they think, oh, well, then they're going to get kicked off the team or something else like that. So we have to eliminate, I want, you know, organizations, gymnastics organizations, to eliminate, first of all, that fear from the gymnasts, because that is a very real thing. And, you know, I can guarantee at least like 80% of gymnasts are afraid of that, because those things happen. I can give multiple examples of that happening in the past, when athletes are afraid to speak up because they're afraid to get kicked off the team.
Yeah, and you know, I'm a firm believer that what has to happen is they have to be heard as soon as possible. The problem with being heard is if people don't believe them, in other words, it doesn't sound like it's true, then what happens is they don't act on it quickly enough. But we have to understand a very important point. There has to be room for a person to be innocent of the accusation so that it's easier for everybody around. Because imagine being in the position of you've got the coach, you're responsible for the coach and the athlete. And you haven't seen the coach do anything, but the athlete is saying something, right? Well, you have to listen to that athlete. That has to happen. That athlete has to be listened to, right? And then there has to be an investigation. Not guilty because of the accusation, but because an investigation turns up the fact that it happened. And it has to happen in a way, you see, it's a community thing. Honestly, if you're running the organization, you don't want to destroy people because of accusations. You want to protect the children. That should be your priority. Protect the young, protect them, listen to them. And here's the most important thing. Those young girls weren't told he wasn't allowed to do that because the people who run the organization didn't think it was important enough. And that's what worries me more than anything. We had a saying when I was growing up. I don't know if they do it at your age at this time. We used to call making our kids street safe, teaching them, and that's what has to happen with these young athletes. They need to be told they have rights. They need to be told that nobody's allowed to touch them. They need to be told all that stuff so they don't take it and say, oh, I'm scared. They need to understand it can't happen. The fear is that once they're told that, some people are afraid that they're going to say, oh, this is a way for me to power somebody. But we got to stop what's going on. So we have to figure out a way to allow the children to understand their rights. Believe it or not, that sounds silly, doesn't it? Children have rights too. And let them understand they have rights and let them protect themselves.
You're absolutely right. Kids need to be taught that. And another thing that, while watching the film documentary, I realized that USA Gymnastics did very wrong. Larry Nassar was a doctor, and you can't be an athlete without having a doctor. You need a doctor. You need someone to examine you, examine your injuries, examine your body. But those kids were 12, 13, 14-year-olds. They were not adults. They were not over 18, not over 19. So what shocked me is that they were in the room with Larry Nassar, their doctor, alone, without a coach, without a parent, without another adult present, which is absolutely wrong in my opinion. I think when you go to an examination by a doctor, and if you're not a fully aged person, then I think there has to be a chaperone, whether it's your coach, because I understand why parents aren't always allowed in certain gymnastics camps, but then take your coach. Your coach has to go with you. Your coach is a female. She'll, most of the time, she'll see if something's wrong. Because when I was a gymnast, I had a doctor too. Our team had a doctor. Never was a girl allowed to go to a doctor's appointment without a parent or a coach. So I think that's where USA Gymnastics went wrong as well. I think that's something that really needs to be implemented there. And I think that should be a rule in every single organization. I don't think an athlete, underage athlete, should ever be allowed to go to a doctor's appointment alone without a chaperone.
There are a lot of sports where that happens, where that is actually the case. Nobody goes alone, in that situation, especially underage. It's even to the point now where it doesn't even matter if they're underage. That their organizations are beginning to understand everybody, whatever side of the equation they are in this, however they think. For example, the idea of having somebody go in there with them is basically saying you can't be trusted. Too bad. Yeah. Too bad. It's just because it has to happen for the people who want to protect the doctor. It's good for them. For those who want to protect the athlete, the young athlete, it's good for them to have a second party in there to ensure what's going on is correct. Because there has to be an opportunity for the child to say to somebody, they can't say it to the person that's touching them inappropriately. They have to have somebody to say, I don't like that. And then that person says, stop. even if they don't know what they're doing, even if they're not doing anything wrong. The doctor doesn't have to be accused at that point. All that happens is you don't do that. But if somebody's in there to protect the child, that's what has to happen. And, I think that is one of the things that did come out of that movie and did come out of that gymnastics thing, is that, the U.S. Gymnastics Federation understood that maybe that has to change. It's they need to be heard and they need to be protected. And they can't be left alone with anybody. No child behind a closed door should be left alone with any adult. That's the way it has to be. In hockey, they've done that. A lot of times, the door has to be left open. There's all these policies that organizations have, like simple things like leaving the door open. Now, for something like that, you don't want to leave the door open if someone's, I don't know, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but you understand the point I'm making, is that at the end of the day, there has to be an open, trusting relationship that it doesn't cross any lines, even when they're crossed accidentally, because you know what? That can happen too, right? I mean, I don't like to be touched by some people. I get nervous when we joke about men. There's things men don't like, we don't want it to happen, but the people who are doing it, the doctor that's doing it, going, look, this is a normal thing, shut up and grow up, right? But you know what, if a person doesn't like something, they have a right to express that, and they have a right to feel comfortable, and that's really what this comes down to, right?
Absolutely, I agree. And especially he had a specific role. In USA Gymnastics, Larry Nassar was a physiotherapist. Yeah, so he was responsible for injuries, for cramps and stuff like that. Things that he did, and I will not get into the semantics, but things that he did were not supposed to be done by any physiotherapist in the world, any at all. So, yes, some things are normal for certain doctors to do, but it's also, he tricked everyone. He tricked everyone by using fancy words to describe medical terms. He tricked not just the gymnasts, but coaches and everyone around him. So it's really important to also do your research and pay attention to things like that.
And the biggest mistake is they cannot be there alone with a young girl.
Exactly.
It's just inappropriate, unacceptable, and for their own protection, they shouldn't be in that position. So if you don't want a false accusation leveled at you, it's in your best interest to have somebody in there that can at least say, wait a second, I didn't see that, so it's best for everybody. That openness, that security blanket that another person can be, we need to make sure that happens. So that's why when a movie like that comes out, I know it seems like sensationalism. I know when it seems like it, but the reality is something happened, and the people involved that want to be involved in the sport need to know it's changed. The interest in being a part of this go.
Oh, Frank, sorry, something was with your connection. I didn't hear the last thing you said.
Oh, okay. Basically, we all, essentially what it comes down to is that we're all responsible for our behavior. And sometimes, people do and say things they regret. And sometimes there's no way out, whether it's someone leveling an accusation that isn't true or somebody that does something that's unacceptable. It's difficult.
Absolutely. And I hope things change. I hope this documentary is really eye-opening, and I think even people who aren't interested in gymnastics at all have to watch it because it's important. And I really hope, as tragic as this incident was, I hope it opens the eyes of people, and I hope things really change in the gymnastics world.
We'll leave it there. Elizabeth Stan, thank you for being on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm gonna miss having you on Wednesdays.
True.
All the best.